tebliğlerini takdim edecekler. Kendilerini daha fazla bekletmeden müsaadenizle artık İngilizce sunumların takdimi için onları davet edeceğim. Hayırlı akşamlar ve hürmetler efendim. Pazar günü İstanbul'da görüşmek niyazıyla. Welcome James, welcome Omid. Dr. Morris, it's very nice to see you. And would you please turn on your mic? We are very happy to have you. Professor Morris is from Boston College Theology Faculty, and he is going to be talking about Ibn Arabi's Futuhat al-Mekkiye's 178 chapter about the sir, about the secret. And so, Professor Morris, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And many thanks to all of the organizers that I know and those I don't know of this wonderfully themed and timed conference. My apologies for if I'm going to try and fit it all in a half hour, it's going to be a little fast speaking in English, which is one reason I wanted to make the translation at least available to everyone. So if my speaking gets too long, you can always at least refer to the translation. So I'm also going to, before we get into the translation, I'm going to kind of go through the abstract and some of the background to the sir that's translated there. If I understand, we have a half hour basically. Is that correct, Johnzy?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So the most fundamental practical lessons in the long chapter 178 of Ibn Arabi's Futuhat, entitled On the Inner Awareness, the Ma'rifah of the Spiritual Station of Love, are memorably summarized in the Sheikh's revealing account of its mystery or its innermost heart, its sir, later in chapter 559. That's what we've translated for this purpose. The starting point of this key passage is the Sheikh's observation, back in chapter 178, that only human beings, among all the other creatures, are usually, with the rarest of saintly exceptions, so poignantly unaware of and so disturbingly unresponsive to the absolute universality of God's infinite love or loving mercy, rahmah. With regard to all the rest of creation, as he explains in chapter 178, the gateway to our dawning awareness of that loving mercy is the omnipresence of divine beauty. But people themselves present a very different and much more challenging matter. And by way of the importance of beauty in this context, I wanted to read out a translation from the list of forms of awareness, or ma'arif, at the end of chapter 366 on the spiritual way station of Mahdi's helpers. There, Ibn Arabi says, and then this way station is the awareness, ma'arifah again, that what God made manifest to our vision is the bodies of all things, in the bodies of all things, is an adornment for those bodies. That the awareness of why it is that some of what is manifest seems ugly to a particular person when they consider it ugly. And the awareness of which eye it is that a person sees with when they see the whole world as beautiful, when they do see it, so that they respond to the world spontaneously with beautiful actions. Now, this awareness is one of the most beautiful and most beneficial forms of awareness of the world. So the main topic of chapter 178, which is summarized in this summary that we'll get to shortly, is God's love, not our love of God, but God's love for all creation, and as the source, the mother of all creation. And this little passage on beauty is a reminder that our awareness of that divine presence and our reciprocation of that love is something that's natural, but also subject to a number of obstacles. But in regard to beauty is just a wonderful illustration of the way this is not tied to some historical period, some particular religion, some particular teaching, that is absolutely just spontaneously rooted in human beings and their awareness of the divine presence and the divine love. So starting with the mystery of our habitual unconsciousness of all but our own few scattered favorite manifestations of that boundless divine love, Ibn Arabi then unfolds the practical pathways, the everyday adab, underlying our gradually deepening recognition of God's all-encompassing loving mercy, with all the active personal responses that unfolding awareness demands of us. And I'll emphasize this more, we get the translation, but in an audience of academics, especially, or people used to universities, it's important that understand that for Ibn Arabi, haq, al-haq, is always what is right and what is demanded of us, perhaps more so or more obviously than being truth and reality, which are the things that we ordinarily associate with that term haq. So that lifelong journey of growing into the love of God, he admits, starts with the paradoxically guiding and purifying role of suffering. That is, with the revealing laments, scars, and painful misadventures that flow from our compelling egoistic desires, our basharik hawa, or what we most often understand by the word love in everyday English. The resonances of this teaching with the familiar opening movements of Rumi's Masnavi, with the Song of the Reed and the opening story cycle of the King and Handmaiden, are anything but accidental. As for the remaining stages of this universal spiritual school of love, Mazhab-e-Ishq, that is, each soul's uniquely educational life adventures of suffering, of the resulting empathy, and the corresponding active response of beautiful acts of service, ihsan, he leaves that longer, necessarily personal story to be written and eventually shared by each of his students. Now, a few words by way of background to this seer, or this summary at the end of the Futuhat. First of all, I'd like to underline the utter misleading impoverishment of English terms for love, of Rahma and Hub, which are the two terms that Ibn Arabi is usually analyzing here. I just received recently a book by the Tunisian filmmaker and artist Nasser Khamir on love, with his paintings and his definitions drawn from all the early Arabic dictionaries of more than 60 Arabic names for dimensions of love. In English, you could stretch it maybe 10 or so, but they wouldn't be things we usually think of as love. So the result is that in everyday English, love often translates a kind of human desire for something, whereas in Ibn Arabi, given the notions of Rahma and Hub, what he's referring to here is our personal inner appreciation and awareness, ma'rifah. In fact, I have to say this translation of Hub here has to be, especially when we're referring to love of God, is appreciation and awareness of what is real and obligatorily, intrinsically valued, al-haq. So here he begins with I'm summarizing here, but most of chapter 178 is a extended commentary. It doesn't always say so, but it's always the underlying there. On the Quranic verse, he loves them and they love him, yuhibbuhum yuhibbunahu, which refers to the qawm, or the awliya Allah, the instruments of God's love in this world and beyond, to the centrality of the awliya as the living, ever-present exemplars of that total love of God. Almost as important are two divine sayings, Hadith Qudsi, the Hadith of the Wali, or the Nawafil, and the Hadith of the hidden treasure. I was, where in both cases God speaking, and the hidden treasure, I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known. So I created creatures and human beings so that I might be known. So what I really want to start this year really begins, though, is this remark of Ibn Arabi's that everything in creation has its inbuilt essential praise and love of God. Tasbih fitri dhati. And then he says, except for those creatures endowed with the power of reflection, tafakkur. And those are only the rational souls of human beings and the jinn, specifically in respect to their individual souls, not their bodies. So this specific, all what certainly looks like a defect in human beings at first is what he's taking up in this seer. In particular, several obvious questions arise here. One is, why can't we human beings, like all other creatures, just automatically, transparently love God and be aware of God's love? Another one is, what could possibly be gained by the human freedom for choosing unconsciousness, heedlessness, or even angry rejection, kufr, of that fundamental reality of existence, and with all the suffering that capacity repeatedly entails for us, what the Quran calls uquba, often translated as punishment, and it certainly feels that way. And third basic question, why the built-in tension in the earthly human condition surrounding the prioritizing of our scattered bodily or basharic desires of hawa instead of reciprocal divine love, hub, which defines insan, the real human being. Finally, I would emphasize again that Ibn Arabi's secrets, or seer, here in chapter 1559, are not in any way beliefs or conceptual theoretical ideas or theses. They're simply existential pointers, isharat, to a universal human process of spiritual learning in which we are all always directly participating. That is the process of tahqiq, or realization of the divine haq, of what is real and obligatory. Every reader unavoidably has to provide their own realized insights and directly experienced understanding. I love the way you can summarize that in Turkish as just aşk, from the majazi to the hakiki. So that is our subject here, but it takes a lot longer to say it in Arabic or in English. So now to turn to this translation that you have before you, hopefully on the screen. The lines here just refer to the lines in which I've translated them, not to the lines of the Arabic. The whole thing is about 5 or 6 very dense lines of Arabic. So the title really, in a way, summarizes everything. And you'll notice what I have to do is to explain what Ibn Arabi means by the Arabic words that he uses, because he loves, I think, almost without exception, he takes familiar, often Quranic Arabic vocabulary and takes it back to its original, deepest meanings that you find in the Arabic dictionaries, often of poetry. So the title, or not title, but the beginning of this explanation of this secret is Nadab Adab. It's that simple. But turns out that Nadab is many things. In fact, both are kinds of calling. Let's see, I'll look at my paper here because the person is, somehow it's in my screen at least, this is moving, it shouldn't, but the first lines is lamenting. That is what we have done wrong or what we've suffered, and this would lead to tauba. So lamenting here stands for tauba, for the ways that suffering leads us to return to God or to reflect on our experience. And another meaning of a nadab, in root meaning, is of scarring, something that leaves permanent scars, and suffering applies to both of those things. And he says, is adab. Well, adab here is being used in its original sense of a calling to a wedding or a banquet or a celebration. You have to go back to the dictionaries. That's not the everyday meaning. But more particularly throughout this sir, and indeed throughout most of chapter 178, Ibn Arabi is looking at how this is seen from God's point of view, from the point of view of hub ilahi, of divine love. And from that point of view, the lamenting and suffering that is very inherent in the earthly human condition is part of God's education or training, adab in that sense, ta'dib in the more often the second form in modern Arabic. And he says this is a trace, this lamenting or scarring is a trace, a track. The word athar here is referring back to the Arabic, pre-Islamic Arabic poets, and adab, transforming that trace of what suffering that looks like something other than love, leads to saluk, following up on that trace. So in a way, this here is like one of those qasidas that if you know early Arabic poetry and so forth. So If we look at what is the deeper nature and purpose of our suffering in life, we will begin to be led towards an awareness of this infinite divine love. So whoever follows their impulse of desire, their hawa, does not attain their ultimate destiny, yet they will attain what they do desire. There's an echo here of Ibn Arabi's famous explanation in the Fusus al-Hikam about adhab and the adhab of those who follow things other than what is their ultimate desire. And they're still following that sweet, the other meaning of adhab, and not a punishment. The punishment is their separation from God, their imperfection, but they're not aware of that if they're completely swallowed up by their earthly desires. And the rest of this is really follows. If one follows this deepest ultimate desire of Hawa, then God's Rahmah and the rest of these, almost all the lines of this section have to do with this awareness of God's infinite loving mercy. It's a kind of old-fashioned word in English, biblical term, but it catches something certainly. Mercy does not translate this at all, compassion, but it's dynamic and creative and going on and everywhere, everything in creation, all instance. We don't have any word approaching that in English. But Rahmah, I've also translated here in the feminine because it's Ibn Arabi, when he refers to Rahmah, is always thinking of the root of this term in the womb. So it's in French, when I first saw this, and Elie Shiraki did a translation in French of, he called it l'amour matriciel, that it's both maternal and the matrix of all being. So the womb of the divine creativity is takes on all these dimensions, which are then enumerated in this following section. So this Rahmah is not includes everything, is not limited to a particular abode or level of creation, our dwelling place, and everything that exists, al-mawjudat, all of them are her children. In chapter 178, we often think the vocabulary of being, often from the philosophers and Avicenna, Farabi, and others, it was taken over in Ibn Arabi and some other mystics about this time. We often think of that as being the primary expression of Ibn Arabi's teaching, but in chapter 178, he says very importantly that what's real is this hub, that the root of all being is this divine love, this divine loving mercy, and that is what brings things into existence. So, and again, this is a very long philosophical conceptual explanation there of what is summed up in the I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known hadith, so that I created where God is speaking. So you could go on through here because everything in English, again, we have this problem when you get down, since there is nothing there in all of creation, but her, the divine loves beautiful good works. But that's really not the translation. Ihsan is acting of doing what is good and what is beautiful, not some objects, but rather that everything is the manifestation of this acts of Ihsan and these blessings. And these favors are all devised to perfect, to tadib, to educate her children, the human beings in particular. And in that context, and again, he's looking at life on this earth as a kind of school or a kind of family, where reprimands are what's often translated as punishments, but the consequences of our actions, when those are inappropriate actions, are spiritual discipline, adab, though only the orafa, only those who are truly knowing are unaware of that. And here, let me just make an excursus here. On the one hand, we can say, though, with him, it's true that the truly knowing are unaware of that. But it's also nice that we have a good long time to live on earth, because almost always the things that seem like the severest punishments and misfortunes and causes of suffering and so on, if we live long enough, we often are fortunate enough to be aware of the wisdom that was behind all of those in life. So the truly knowing among God's children certainly in many respects is a term and a phrase that epithet that applies to all of us if we keep looking at what's happening in life. So the next theme that he discovers, lines 19 to 26 here, is the universality of Iman here. What is Iman? Again, we have no word in English that captures that. Faith comes closest, but you cannot imagine anything more opposite to belief, as it's often mistranslated in English versions of the Quran and so forth. Faith, Iman here, is the absolute height of wisdom and understanding and awareness. And certainly it is for when Ibn Arabi is talking about it. And it comes to us through what is haq, what is real. But also, and here's where he begins to get into the paradoxes that he's going to conclude with here. Just that it has come through what is false, batil. So it's this contrast of what's real and what's false that enables us in our basharic state here on earth to begin to appreciate what is real, what is right, and what is true. And that's where the tafakkur, that if you go back to what he said in chapter 178, that it's reflection, tafakkur is so many things, but tafakkur is inseparable from the ayat, from the divine signs in reality. And it's tafakkur that translates the ayat, which is all of life and all of experience, into wisdom and understanding, and crucially into love, universal love that is expressed in. Okay, so, so he emphasizes this is not in vain. So what is excellent? So there's faith is part of who we are, whoever we are, not necessarily conscious faith, but and that faith, when one acts on it, as the Quran says, it is incumbent on us, on the divine, to support the persons of faith. This, and again, as I said, this gets more and more paradoxical as he goes along. He says, therefore, worship, serve your Lord until what is certain comes to you. Well, often that what is certain is understood as death, but what Ibn Arabi is substituted for the Quranic verse where it said Allah, worship God, all of the divine names and realities. He's using these very technical terms. With your Lord, and your is singular, just when you become, that's also singular in the next line. So that what he's saying here is that every human being has a certain constellation of desires and understandings and awarenesses unique to that person, which is the Rabb, their personal Lord, if you will, their personal God, if you could say that, the God that is limited by their imagination, their awareness, their experience. But in order to become fully certain, to reach yaqeen, the Ainul yaqeen, Hakal yaqeen of the sort of the Takathur, you have to become fully certain. And when you've reached that certainty, that universality of awareness, then you will know who is the object of your faith. And that who, of course, is Allah or Al-Haq, the universal, the full divine presence in whatever we encounter in this world and the next. And then the conclusion, therefore, Adam, God's teaching, God's purification, education, transformation of us from the contingent and partial loves of this world to our universal love, that it contains every sort of good, everything that's desired, because of its derivation from the word maduba. Ibn Arabi loves to create these kind of educational etymologies. I don't think, and in this case, the point is that images of the afterlife, of the life of the souls that have been perfected, are, of course, of the heavenly banquet in the divine presence, which goes through both the Quran and the Hadith accounts of that ultimate state. So then you get this very puzzling and I think very rich last line of this sir. Those who most immensely enjoy that banquet are an orphan of close kin or one who is destitute and downtrodden. As I mentioned in the footnote, this is one of the many phrases describing the people of the right hand, or how difficult and challenging sort of the Aqaba, the difficult ascent towards perfection and divine illumination. But so on one, what's odd there is there in the Quran, it's referring to those who give help to an orphan of close kin or feed one who is destitute and downtrodden. But what Ibn Arabi does by separating off that object is to highlight the fact that it's those of us who are most deeply aware of the suffering, the loneliness, the difficulty of this life, who are actually most appreciative of God's blessings and God's love. So the orphan of close kin, taken out of the Quranic context there, would immediately, of course, bring up the image of the messenger, Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and of the Hakikate Muhammadiyah. So that paradoxically, of course, this is the person who said, Al-Fakru Fakhri, my pride is in my poverty or my needfulness. So the person who is most aware of the blessings in this world is the person who's also most deeply and empathically aware of the sufferings of beings, whenever they're suffering, shall we say, and wherever that may be, of that kind of fundamental niyaz, which Rumi begins with, as I said, in both the opening poem and then the first story cycle of the Masnavi, and the one who is destitute and downtrodden likewise. So there's no negation here of the plain meaning or what we usually take to be the plain meaning of the Surah Al-Aqaba. And you really have to go back. It's just a wonderful account of the steep mountain pass that is constituted by our life here in this world and what is asked of us. And of course, the same phrase, of course, applies to the awliya within this world and beyond, who are those who are aware of the needs of and respond with love to the needs of all those who are in that needy state in this world. So I think I managed to do this in exactly 30 minutes. Thank you very much, Tashakur Adanim. And I guess we'll let Amit gets to go, and then we might have some questions if we're lucky at the end, right?
Thank you very much, Professor Morris. We appreciate it. Omidjan, shall I start the recording? Okay, thank you. And Professor Omid Safi from Duke University, Islamic Studies professor. Just a moment, I'm gonna share my screen.
And the essential feature of the Mazhab Ishq, those who are in it for God's own sake, not for the sake of getting into heaven, not for the sake of avoiding the torment of hellfire, but for the love of Allah. It is that quest for love, even above and beyond salvation. It is when you love the gardener more than you love the garden. And we see examples of this that show up in the Sufi tradition. There's a well-known teaching of Hazrat Rabi'a Basri. خداوندا اگر تو را از خوف دوزخ می پرستم در دوزخم بسوز. Oh Lord, if I worship you for fear of hell, burn me in that hell. اگر به امید بهشت می پرستم بر من حرام گردان. If I worship you hoping for paradise, make it forbidden for me. But if I worship you only for your own sake, اگر از برای تو را می پرستم، جمال باقی از من دریغم مدار. But if I worship you only for your own sake, do not withhold from me your everlasting beauty. Do not withhold from me your everlasting beauty. So that teaching, which is traced back to Hazrat Rabia, is a reminder of those who have always been in love with God and for God. And of course, within this tradition, we're also told that we would never have begun to seek God. We wouldn't have dared to dream of the love of Allah if we were not already loved first. So examples of this abound. Bayezid Bistami, that wonderful great saint of Khorasan, has a saying in which once he reaches the age of 60, he communicates with God. He whispers to God, "Oh my Lord, I have been seeking after you for 60 years. I've loved you for 60 years. I've loved you my whole life." And he hears a response back from the divine, Bayezid, "I have loved you since before there was a thing called time. I have loved you since pre-eternity." And this teaching that our love for God is only made possible for having been loved first shows up in poetic ways in the teachings of Hazrat Maulana Rumi. So he has a wonderful poem which uses that same metaphor that we see in the Zen tradition, the koan tradition, but he uses it differently. He uses the example of a one-handed clapping. Of course, one hand by itself cannot create the sound of clapping. You need two hands to have that clapping sound. And so he says, "No lover would seek union if the beloved were not seeking her. When the lightning bolt of love for the friend has shot into this heart, know this, there is also love in that heart." If you have love in your heart, know that there's also love in God's heart. When love for God doubles in your heart, have no doubt, God also loves you. Have you ever heard the sound of one-handed clapping? A thirsty man moans, "Oh, precious water." Water moans back, "Who wants to drink me?" Right? So we are thirsty for water, but water is also thirsting for us, right? That's another reason why sometimes we hear in Maulana's teachings that if you wish to find water, increase in thirst. That's the way that will lead us. So this relationship of love between God and the human is indeed something that deepens and enriches and invigorates the more conventional language of the creator and the created, God as the Lord and the master, and us as the servant. And it adds that dimension of friendship, to call on God as a friend, the perpetual companion. In fact, we know this because in the seerah, in the biography of the Holy Prophet, one of the very last words that he uttered was, "Ar-Rafiq al-A'la," the highest friend, the highest companion. It's in that moment where the veils are lifted, not that for the Prophet there were ever any veils, but that this cycle of an earthly existence is wrapped up, and he addresses God as who God has been all along, the highest friend. This language of friendship is also a part of it, but the Sufis of this particular path, even more than friendship, they appreciated the language of ishq, ashq in Turkish, which I've translated as radical love. So there's mahabba or hubb, which is the more conventional kind of loving kindness. That's the Quranic term that we find. And ashq in Turkish, ishq in Persian and Arabic is the even more intense version of it. So ishq is that fire that burns away anything in us that is other than Allah. And of course, there is nothing other than Allah, other than the illusion of separatedness. Historically, many of the early Sufis had come to divide love, ishq, into two types. They spoke of there being a majazi and a haqiqi, a metaphorical love and a real love. So many of them stated that love for other human beings, for our fellow creation, is only a metaphor. But real love, they said, is something saved for God. But in the time of Ahmad Ghazali, who lives about 150 years before the time of Maulana, that picture is complicated a little bit. Ahmad writes this beautiful book called the Savaneh, which has been translated also into English. And he's asked by his companions and friends to write them a book on love. And he says, fine, I'll write you your book on love on one condition. بشرط آنکه در او هیچ حواله نبود، نه به خالق و نه به مخلوق. I'll write you this book on love on the condition that you do not divide it, you don't bifurcate it into the love for the creator and the love for creation. There is one love. And the way that he speaks of love is very much in this poetic metaphor, but the intention is clear. So he goes back to that wonderful verse of the Quran in which God speaks of bringing forth a people whom God loves and they love God. يُحِبُّهُمْ وَيُحِبُّونَهُ. And this is what Ahmad Ghazali says about that verse. Asl ishq az qidam rabat. The root of ishq, the real heart of this love, comes from pre-existence, from before there's a time of existence. نقطه بای یحبهم به تخمی در زمین یحبونه افکندند. So the nukta, the dot that is under the letter B in Arabic, Persian, Ottoman, Urdu, the dot under the B of yuhibbuhum, God loves them, is placed as a seed in the fertile soil of yuhibbunahu, they love God. So that from that seed, they love God, leads forth to a beautiful flower, the flower of love. And that flower is going to have the same color, the same essence, the same fragrance as the original seed, which is that divine love. So our love for God and God's love for us, same seed and same fruit, hamrang, one color, one essence. So this is when we're getting to see this notion of there being one love, not this division into real love and metaphorical love, one love. And he begins the book by writing a quatrain as a commentary on that Quranic verse, the yuhibbuhum wa yuhibbunahu. in which Ahmad Ghazali says that it is for our sake that ishq came into being, that from all of these worlds we have been intended, we are the intention of ishq. And that when ishq crossed over from non-existence into being, riding on the steed, on the horse of the spirit, ever since then, the lamp of union has illuminated our night. So this is what we get in the Sabaneh of Ahmad Ghazali. His main student, Ainul Ghazat Hamadani, elaborates on this in that delicious and mischievous style that the Sufis love to speak in. He says, really, there's three kinds of love. There is the great love, which is God's love for us. There is the little love, which is our love for God. So the great love is God for us. The small love is our love for God. And then there is a middle love. And do you want me to tell you what the middle love is? The one that moderates these two. That is the linchpin between our love for God and God's love for us. That one, he says, I cannot put into words. So there's always this notion that they're not writing a philosophical treatise here. This is not the systematic realm of kalam to come up with words about God. Love has to be lived. Love has to be tasted. And indeed, one has to burn in the fire of love. What is clear from Ainul Ghazat Hamadani is that he says that this mazhab ishq, this path of radical love, is nothing other than God's own path. So he attributes this back to Mansur Hallaj. He was asked, which madhab, which school, which path do you follow? And at that time, there was the Shafi'i madhab, and the Hanafi madhab, and the Maliki madhab, and the Hanbali madhab, and the Jafari madhab. Which madhab do you follow? And instead of answering the question legally, or in terms of the school of kalam, or theology, or philosophy, Hallaj simply says, I follow God's madhab. أنا على مذهب ربي من بر مذهب خداام. I simply follow God's path, which is none other than this path of love. So over the years, many of the people who have explicated this mazhab ishq have come to that wonderful recognition that in the mazhab ishq, one may even speak of, if you would, a kind of Holy Trinity. But instead of this being the Christian Trinity, this is the Trinity of love, lover, and beloved. Ishq, ashiq, mashuq, which are one. So the first part of this is to recognize that the one whom we think of as the ultimate beloved, God, is actually the ashiq, actually the lover. It is God who loves us. We wouldn't even be capable of having love for God if God was not already displaying that love. That the whole of creation is an act of divine love. كنت كنزا مخفيا فأحببت أن أعرف. I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be intimately known. I yearned to be intimately known. When God is still a hidden treasure, فأحببت, I loved. That love is pre-existence, pre-temporal, pre-creation, pre-us, pre-words. And then we're going to get to the second part, that the lover and the beloved are one, and so is love. There is this identification of love with the divine that we'll come to see. So let's take a look at what one of the friends of Hazrat Maulana, Fakhruddin Iraqi, has to say about this. Iraqi is one of the ones who combines the tradition of Persian Sufism with the teachings of Ibn Arabi. He writes that wonderful book, the Lama'at. And he says the following: Ma'shuq o ishq o ashiq har se yeki ast inja, chun wasl dar nagunjad hijran che kar darad. The beloved, love, and lover are all here in this place as one. Har se yeki ast. All three of them are as one. There's no room to speak of union here. What do we even have to say about separation? So unlike many of the previous Sufis who spend a lot of time talking about that experience of feeling separated from Allah, not only do they speak about union, they're like the three are one. The lover is the beloved. What more can one say? Now, to keep us from having delusions of thinking that somehow we ourselves are somehow the cosmic lover and the cosmic beloved, they always supplement those kinds of poems and stories with reminders from Hazrat Maulana, such as the story of the one who comes to see the friend and knocks at the door. The voice of the friend comes from the inside. Who is it? And the friend standing outside says, it's me. And the friend on the inside says, well, I'm already here. And there's no room here for two me's. There's no room here for two I's. Go away. So the friend goes and suffers in the pain of separation till he becomes cooked, and he comes back, and he's learned his lesson now, and he knocks again. The same voice comes, who is it? And this time he says, it's you, O charmer of hearts. And the friend says from the inside, well, since it's me, come into me, right? So there's no room for two egos here. There's no room for two I's here. You cannot go into God with your ego. You got to park your ego outside. The ego has to burn in the fire. This is what indeed many sages have said about the great sin of the Pharaoh. Wasn't even that he said, I am the Lord on high. It was simply that he said, I. And indeed, it's only Allah who can say, I. A little bit down the centuries, we have another sage, Shah Ni'matullah Wali, who repeats that same notion. Ma'shuq o ishq o ashiq bashad yeki va senam. Love, lover, and beloved are one, though they're called by three names. So they have different names, but they are one. So I want to take a few minutes and talk about the way that Maulana Rumi approaches this in his teachings. There's a wonderful poem that he has. It's a beloved poem to many people. It's still sung to this day. And it describes his visionary experience of love. Man ghulam qamaram, ghayr qamar hich magu. I serve that moonlight beauty. Say nothing to me unless it's about her. Speak nothing of sorrow, speak only words of this treasure. دوش دیوانه شدم، عشق مرا دید و بگفت. Last night I became love crazed. Love saw me and said, I've come. Don't shout. Say nothing. گفتم ای عشق من از چیز دیگر میترسم. Rumi says, oh, I've tried this love thing before and I got hurt in the past. I said, love, I'm afraid of something else. گفت آن چیز دیگر نیست. دیگر هیچ نگو. Love said, there is nothing else. Say nothing. Let me whisper secrets in your ear. Say nothing. And at this point, Rumi's becoming agitated and he's like, well, what are you? Are you a human? Are you an angel? Are you a gem? I said, what a beauty. Are you an angel? Are you human? Love answers, not an angel, not a human. Say nothing. And at this point, Rumi's like, well, if you're not a human, then you're not an angel. I said, what is this? Say it. Love said, shh. Stay like this. Say nothing. Then here's the part where this is as close as Maulana will let himself come in revealing what really love is. گفتم ای دل پدری کن نه که این وصف خداست. I said, oh, my heart, have some mercy. Aren't you describing God? گفت این هست ولی جان پدر هیچ نگو. Love said, yes, my child, it is. But hush, say nothing. So there's that notion for Hazrat Maulana that ultimately this love is a description of the divine. It is the quality of God. And I want to, as we move towards wrapping up, I want to give you a few poems of Maulana which have not usually been translated. And these give us an indication of how cosmic, celestial love really is for Maulana Rumi. He says at one point, زاده است مرا مادر عشق از اول صد رحمت و آفرین بر آن مادر باد. He says, Mother Ishq, Mother Love gave birth to me in the first days. In the beginning, when God is spilling over, what gave birth to me was love. I was made out of love. I was born through love. Love is my mother, and 100 blessings be upon that mother. So this notion that the universe is not only made through love and for love, that love is the agent that brings us into being. Yes, another beautiful poem in which he talks about the way in which this world is made. And remember that for Muslims, also for Greeks and Hindus and others, they oftentimes spoke of the 4 elements: khak, bad, ab, atash. Earth element, water element, fire element, and the air element. من که باشم باد و خاک و آب و آتش مست اوست. آتش او تا چه آرد بر من و بر خاک و باد. Who am I? Earth, wind, fire, and air are all intoxicated with God. His fire is what has fallen upon me and upon all of these elements. عشق از او آبستن است و این 4 از عشق او. این جهان زین 4 زاد و این 4 از عشق زاد. So this is a poetic language, right? Love, ishq, is pregnant with God. And these four elements are pregnant from ishq. God gives birth to love, and love gives birth to everything in this world. So these kind of poems and teachings really give us a sense of the intimate connection that love has. Not only is it the quality of God, it is that first principle of creation. And he ends this section with a reflection that ishq is also ultimately to be identified with the being of the Prophet. Remember that just as the first thing that God creates or gives birth to or spills over into is ishq, in another saying, the Prophet says, reveals, displays that the first thing that God created was his spirit. So if you put these two side by side, what do we see? We see that the spirit of the Prophet, the Nur Muhammad, the Ruh Muhammad, the Muhammadi light, is pure divine love. عشق است طریق و راه پیغمبر ما. ما زاده عشق و عشق شد مادر ما. Ishq is our tariq, our path. Ishq is راه پیغمبر ما. Love is the way of our Prophet. We are born from love, and love has become our mother. So this identification not only of the path of love, but also with the notion that it is the way of the Prophet. And this shows up in many different traditions. If you read the Futuhat al-Makkiyah of Sheikh al-Akbar ibn Arabi, he has a very subtle reference in a place that he calls the Prophet Rasul Muhibbin, the chief of the lovers. There are many, many lovers, but the Sayyidul Kawnain, the Rasul Muhibbin, the chief of the lovers, is none other than Hazrat Payghambar. And as we move to wrapping up, we see that Maulana Rumi at one point says, this ishq is not abstract, it's not theoretical, it's something you live, it's something you breathe, it's something that guides you towards Allah. It's the astrolabe. And the Prophet at one point was asked, well, you are the beloved of God. You are Habibullah, and you are taken by God on the Mi'raj to see God face to face. How can we see God face to face? And his response was, your Mi'raj is the salat, is the prayers. Maulana takes that saying and says that the real prayer is to pray with love. Do your prayer, but do it with love. And this is what he offers. Ishq mi'rajist suye bam sultan jamal. Love is a mi'raj. Love is an ascension, rising up until you see this sultan of beauty, until you have your own face-to-face encounter with God, inshallah. So when we go to Konya, and may it be that we have the opportunity to travel again. It's been such an honor over the last 20 years to bring friends to Turkey and to Morocco. We have this wonderful program, Illuminated Tours. May it be that we get to go on these journeys again. When we go to Konya and you get ready to walk into the Turbe, the Rumi shrine, above the door, there is this beautiful inscription that greets us. Ka'batul Ushaq Bashad in Maqam. This place is the Kaaba of the lovers. Har ke naqis amad inja shud tamam. Everybody who comes here broken down and incomplete leaves tamam, leaves whole. It's a reminder from Maulana that we come on the path not because we're already whole, not because we're already perfect, not because we're already illuminated. We come precisely because we are broken and incomplete and lacking and mired in forgetfulness. Because that's what we can bring to the divine presence. We can bring niyaz, need, dependence, brokenness. And our brokenness is the one thing that is lacking in God's court. So bring your pain, bring your brokenness, bring your vulnerability, and God will purchase it from you. This is really the last of our conversation. In Maulana's own time,
I think the recording is done. Thank you so much, Omid. Wonderful, marvelous. So would you like to complete what you were saying? Or would you like to add something?
Sure, of course. This was just the wonderful story from the Manaqib al-Arifin that we get, which I think illustrates how these kinds of teachings were lived out, of the notion of ishq as an alchemy, as a transmutation of the heart and the soul from what's base into what's illuminated. If you read the stories of Manaqib al-Arifin, certainly there's Maulana and there's Shams and there's Baha'u'llah and all these very saintly people, but you also see about who's around them, and it's it's kind of Bob the Smith and Fatima the farmer. There's a lot of everyday folk who are not particularly yet refined, and they're sometimes arguing and bickering, and so the Parvana, the governor of Konya, at one point says, I love me some Rumi. I love Hazrat Maulana. It's just all these ruffians around him that I can't really stand. They're bi-adab. They're lacking in that sense of refinement and being called to the feast, as Jim so beautifully said. And Maulana picks up pen and paper and writes a letter to the Parvana, and he defends his community by saying, everything you say about them is true. They're rude, they're crude, they're mean, they're ugly, they have no adab, and whatever adab they do have is terrible adab. And his companions are a little confused as to what kind of a defense is this. And then he ends it by saying, I took them on as my murids because they have terrible adab. If they had already beautiful adab, I myself would have become their disciple. And then, because he's Maulana, he composes a poem on the spot. I walk around the bazaar buying fake gold, fake coins. Everyone thinks that I'm mad, but I know a secret that they don't. I have the gift of alchemy. So the real sages are the ones who walk around, not surrounding themselves with the people who are already luminous and illuminated, but buying fake gold because they have that touch of reviving the hearts and changing what is base into what is luminous and golden. And that's, of course, what Ishq does.
Thank you. It is an honor and a great pleasure to be in your presence. both Professor Morris and Professor Safi. I can't emphasize my gratitude for your time, especially particularly on this day, December the 25th. So we have left only 5 minutes to finish the panel. Is there anything you would like to add, Professor Morris? Could you please turn on your mic?
Sorry. Yeah. No, I again, it's a perfect date. I love it when things are so appropriate. That's a sign of extraordinary adab, by the way, because while it may eliminate the number of viewers we have, it is certainly what date could be more appropriate for celebrating the Ishq in all of its dimensions. So thank you, whoever came up with this date. It was very, very well done. Thank you. Mabruk. Okay.
Thank you very much. Omidjan, is there anything you would like to add?
Just my gratitude to Jamal Nurhoja and to all the organizers of this, and to Jim, who is such a esteemed and beloved friend and guide on this path. And Jim, is truly a joy every single time that I get to listen to you. I feel like I'm standing at the shore and there's a diver who's gone deep into the ocean and brought out some new fresh pearls for us. So really, may God bless you and Corey and your whole family. And thank you for being who you are.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's been a spiritual feast. We are very grateful. If there is no questions, we shall end the session.
Okay.
All right. Much love to your families and respect. Thank you very much, Professor Morris. Thank you very much, Professor Safi. We are very grateful.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hafiz.
Hafiz. Yeah.
Allah ısmarladık.
Yeah.
Eyvallah. Efendim, bu paneli bitirdik. Bir sonraki panel galiba 18.30'da başlayacak. Çanakkale Üniversitesi İlahiyat Fakültesi yetkililerine, Üsküdar Üniversitesi Tasavvuf Araştırmaları Enstitüsü yetkililerine çok teşekkür ederiz.